Hi, I'm Megan, and you're listening to Two White Girls, stumbling through the current political and social climate.
Okay, welcome back to the Two White Girls show. This podcast and episode in particular is built off of our previous two podcasts in our War on Poverty series. The first being about our favorite anti-poverty economy stimulators, aka public benefits.
It's a thing.
And it's really important for anyone listening to understand how those benefits are set up and how they are accessed, which end of the moral of the whole story is it's kind of impossible to access all the services and benefits that you need. And a lot of the time, those are looked at as a negative to our economy when really they boost our economy.
And I think that's a really important distinction. A lot of times they're marketed as bailouts and handouts and things like that. So in that podcast, we really go into why they are important and what they're actually intended for versus sometimes how the system blocks people to get them.
And then our second podcast in the series, which goes around the cycle of poverty, as well as like anti-homeless legislation and different kind of situations that people who are in poverty, trying to escape poverty, and just what it really actually looks like. And so that cycle of poverty, all the information we provide there, as well as in our blog, really is the stepping stones to discussing what the war on drugs is in terms of the overarching theme of a war on poverty. Mm-hmm. So please, we're giving you a warning now. If you haven't listened to either of those, we will be referencing them throughout this part 1 and part 2 that will come later about the war on drugs. So you've been warned. If there are things that go over your head, you just have to listen to us more. Like go back and, listen to every word we say.
We know you
maybe
love
take
our voices.
Notes.
Yeah.
Also, to kind of ramp this up a little bit, if you have not seen the documentary 13th that is on Netflix, that is going to totally help you in terms of understanding the overarching war on drugs, in a sense, along with the mass incarceration situation that we have in the United States. So there's so many things
pause us,
that
go
you
back
need to do.
You need to. No worries. No one will know.
I am more than happy for you to pause us, go watch 13th, go listen to our other two podcasts, and then come back to us.
If you need my Netflix account, DM me. It's fine. We'll figure it out.
We can make this happen for you.
We can make it happen for you. It's a very, very, very important documentary. Katie, do you want to kind of start us off? Let's go ahead and just summarize a little bit what this war on drugs is, and then we're really going to dive into probably one of the darkest spots in American modern history.
Definitely. So in terms of the war on drugs, everything can kind of be linked back to the slavery. Is everyone shocked? What a surprise.
We're all shocked.
That everything can kind of be found that it's rooted in what people will disguise as the economy when really it's keeping other people down in order to elevate yourself. Mm-hmm. And by yourself, meaning a typical white male privilege, right?
Yep.
So for our purposes, for even describing how the war on drugs even initially started, it really all goes back to the establishment of the 13th Amendment, where, criminals can be slaves that's not necessarily what it says verbatim, but it really is that once slaves were free, then they could be rounded up, arrested, and then they could be basically back to slavery again. So a lot of this all starts in that timeline, and everything that every presidential administration has done has led to the situations that we have now with mass incarceration, with this idea of what the war on drugs actually is about, because
Versus
it's
what
not
it's marketed.
necessarily about eliminating drugs and just say no to drugs and the variety of PR stunts that have been done about drugs, especially with the current opioid crisis. It's more about who they're targeting and what the actual motivations are.
And I think in order to understand the motivations, you have to go back to that time when the 13th Amendment was ratified. If you don't know and you're feeling really silly, no worries. The Constitution of the United States, this is what the 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. And that's what Katie referenced, that except for punishment with crime, criminals, people within the criminal justice system, which we're about to get to, can be in involuntary servitude, but legally nobody else can. That was a real smack in the face for our country in a lot of different ways, especially economically. The South went from free labor all the time, really wealthy off of other people's work, and as cavalier as that sounds and as ridiculous as that sounds, that's how their life was,
Right.
and so that felt very much ripped from them. Luckily, President Lincoln was shot, and he didn't really leave us a contingency plan, and we had the oh my goodness, what's it called? We had the Reconstruction period, which was a total massive mess because white people wanted it to be a massive mess. And basically slavery continued in the United States for a long time after that. And you're welcome to look up that Reconstruction period to figure, to talk. We don't have time to go into that deeply. That's a whole other podcast in of itself. Yeah. But essentially, sharecropping and slavery was continuing in the South because no one was there to really say stop doing that. A law, I think I've said this on multiple podcasts before. I said it definitely in the War on Poverty multiple times. A law is just a piece of paper unless people buy into it. I said it on the education one as well. And so people did not buy into it until the civil rights movement. And people were really starting to buy into this idea that we are equal. We are equal under the eyes of the law. Everybody needs voting rights. Everybody needs poverty rights, and just everybody needs to be equal. And that was really, really frightening to the Southern, they were currently Democrats actually, Southern white wealthy people, or Southern white people in general, and a lot of Northerners as well. We had about 150 years of inequality, so equality definitely felt like oppression, and in a lot of ways still does, and we'll get there. So that civil rights movement was frightening.
I think what's important too is just to understand that the economy was built off the backs of slaves. And if the economy toppled based on the freeing of slaves, then they had no idea how to continue their way of life. Because it isn't necessarily just that it was, I want to keep slaves because I'm a bad person, and not to totally condone that in any form, in any way, but to just kind of understand that the way the system was set up was that the economy was totally contingent on this free labor. And so I think oftentimes what's important for people to understand is that in that time frame, that sense of horror and frightening, and like the experience of, having a civil war where, it really is neighbor against neighbor, whatever the case may be, it's really comes ultimately down to it was the way the economy was structured. And that's how everyone made their money. And that's how, people continued oppression, and it was horrifying, but it wasn't clean. And I think sometimes looking back on history, we all think things are cut and dry and are clean.
Yes.
And because also everything's whitewashed in terms of how we're educated, especially in elementary school. And so it's kind of one of those things where it's just, I just want to keep people's minds in that understanding that the economy plays a major role
in everything, especially this topic. The other thing that played a major role was the civil rights movement was also very closely tied to anti-war protesters. Prior
Right.
to the Vietnam War, America was like the teenager who showed up with all the good ideas, knocked over the CEO who had been there forever, and started his own startup and was like a millionaire. This is like what I always imagined. Like America, like this badass teenager, right? Like coming in, like the Parkland teen. Actually, I won't. That's a terrible because I'm about to throw them down. I love you, Parkland teens.
Yeah.
But just like this absolutely amazing young, fresh, everyone's behind you energy. And the Vietnam War, because it was the first televised war and a lot of other reasons, was the first time that Americans were not fully behind a war effort, which was also extremely frightening for any administration and any people in wealth, because war is great for, again, the economy. The economy is always boosting, and a president's approval rating is always boosting during wartime, or at least it was, yes, during these efforts. So World War I and World War II were these really, beautiful moments of a country coming together and saying that they were going to fight off. There was it felt very clean. It felt very, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, we are the good guys. And the Vietnam War and plenty of wars after have felt extremely messy and not clean. So the civil rights movement and these anti-war protests were extremely aligned, extremely connected, and extremely frightening to the white establishment. And that's kind of where this idea of a war on drugs got cooked up.
Right, exactly. That it was an idea of that war on crime is synonymous with a certain population of people, Black people, and that a war on drugs was initially targeting hippies or anti-war protesters or, people that spoke up who may have been partook in different kinds of illegal drugs.
Or illegal activities.
Yeah.
The other idea was that turning Southern Democrats into Republicans by being racist. This is my least favorite thing that people say, that Republicans, President Lincoln was Republican. He was not a Republican in the sense that, regardless of what political party you are, he was not a Republican in the sense that we know today, just like the Southern Democrats were not Democrats in the sense that we know today. Southern Democrats were like a working class in the South, but they were very anti the civil rights movement, and because of that, they switched over to become Republicans, and kind of work with this, unknowingly work with this war on poverty idea. So basically criminalizing people for drugs, but only specific drugs, and we're going to get into that.
And it was really subtle.
Yes.
It was not... It was reading what someone is saying. It's the between the lines. It's a specific word choice. It's that, this idea that, you have to hold people down in order to come up and rise up. And so it's then what ended up happening in the way we see Republicans and Democrats today is not the way it used to be at all.
No. And I think when you talk about being subtle, it's also people were feeling, and it's a similar feeling to what people feel now, because it has never gone away. This feeling has never gone away. White people were feeling like they were losing power, they were losing traction, and that's true. They were and are and should, because we should all share power and we should all share traction. So we're gonna have to lose a little bit for other people to gain a little bit. And that feels incredibly uncomfortable. And when you're not able to put a finger on that, and you certainly don't have a lot of the things that we have available to us today to learn about those things, you need someone to blame. And so administrations that we're going to talk about did a really nice job of pointing to anti-war protesters, Black people, and Mexicans as the people who were taking their jobs, Lazy, they were the people on the welfare that we talked about in our first war on poverty. They were the people who smelled bad and were on drugs, and we're gonna come get your kids and take them somewhere far away and turn them into these crazy hippies, or get them onto drugs and make them do terrible sex-driven things. And this was kind of the propaganda that was put out during the civil rights movement and right after, to get people really hyped up about this imaginary black person, this imaginary anti-war protester, and this imaginary Mexican. And that's especially why weed is illegal today, however you feel about that. Weed was specifically made illegal, or Mary Jane was specifically made illegal, so that Mexicans could not cross the border, or they had a reason to criminalize Mexicans who were crossing the border. It is so much easier to blame.
What a shock.
What? Crazy.
That's not something we're still dealing with today at all.
At all. Not at all. No, all of these things are totally tied up in a bow. No, it's something that very much still affects us today. And both the border situation and weed, they are very closely aligned, because it is much easier for an administration to say, look, it's black and brown people's fault that you are poorer than your grandfathers were, rather than saying your grandfathers were rich because whether they owned slaves or not, benefited from free labor. And you can't benefit from that because we don't have that anymore, and we need to figure out a different way. They're not going to tell them the truth. They're going to say, look, it's black and brown people's faults. It's always black and brown people's faults. Let's criminalize them as much as possible, so that you can get richer. Please notice no one's gotten richer off of the war on drugs, or any of these other things that have been put forth to convince people that drugs, black, brown people, and hippies are their problem.
Right. And also the creation of different departments and organizations within the government to hold people down.
Yep.
So the DEA is a big one, right, Megan?
Absolutely, yes. The DEA specifically targets Mexicans and Mary Jane Terrible Weed, and that was created by President Nixon. Nixon was really kind of the grandfather of this idea, that we could get black and brown people and hippies, and that would make America better if we just got these people who were taking our kids in the middle of the night and turning them into drug, sex, infested crazies. And this led very quickly to mass incarceration of black and brown people. And because of that, they also decided that once you had been incarcerated for a federal crime, you could no longer vote. And if you don't... I want to point to you so specifically that was decided because we had this war on drugs that was putting black and brown people in prison at an exuberant rate compared to white people. So it was taking their voting rights after they had earned them through the amendments through our Constitution. So this was really all these backdoor handlings of how can we get out of what we've promised people for equality. How can we get out of equality?
And how can we have free labor?
Yep.
And then not allow them to execute any of their rights as an American citizen.
I think a really nice example of this, and it was set up by Nixon, was the minimum that you can serve in federal prison for crack and cocaine. Crack and cocaine are essentially very similar drugs. I'm not a drug expert by any means.
Nope.
In the 8th grade, I did say that weed was like a white powder or something, so I was clearly not on anything when I was a small child.
You were
so
totally into it.
Yeah, no, not at all. Everyone laughed at me. It was really embarrassing. So that's my little like comic relief there for this episode. But okay, so the minimum difference between crack and cocaine. Obviously a drug that is stereotypically, and not even stereotypically, that is statistically in black neighborhoods, because we do have segregation, and we've talked about that in our war on poverty as well, and the 13th goes into that pretty deeply, so make sure you've looked at all of those things. Is in black neighborhoods. Cocaine is a more used by white people drug. Crack has a much larger minimum sentence in federal prison than cocaine. There is no actual reason. There's no factual reason. We all know I love facts. There's nothing factually different about these drugs that makes one worse than the other, that makes carrying one worse than the other. it truly is that one is used by Black people and one is used by white people. And
Right.
I think that's like the first like little headline that really, when I was younger, that I read, that clued me into that this was not a fair system, that this was not a system set up to keep people safe, that it was actually a system to keep people oppressed.
Yep.
The other really depressing thing before we move on to my least favorite president, besides maybe Andrew Jackson, I don't know, it goes back and forth between Reagan and Jackson, in American history, is the note, and I go into this in our education episode as well, and could go on and on for years, is that they use third grade reading test scores, so the Ohio Reading Guarantee, whatever your third graders are taking in your state, to decide how many prisons they're going to build. Because there's a very direct correlation between education and prison. And we're not going to go into that during this part 1 now, but that's just something that you definitely need to know. And you definitely need to know that our schools are very much still segregated. I talk a long time about that in our education podcast, and that's another piece to this puzzle. If you keep people uneducated, especially in Black and brown neighborhoods, that's going to inform how many prisons we need, because those kids are going to prison. And that's that assumption, because they're basically like cattle being led into that system.
Right. And Megan and I were talking about this when we were preparing for this podcast, of how I feel like a conspiracy theorist.
Yes.
Because this is like, it can't be this obvious, right? It can't be this well laid out, that it's just so obvious and strategic, and you do the slightest amount of digging and it's right there.
I mean, just Google war on drugs, and like all this information is just like laying for you. Like, of course,
we're gonna
put in the blog all the things that we use to research this. And the 13th does a really nice job as well of saying where they get the information. But shoot, a simple Google search in 25 minutes, you are definitely going to have all of this information at your fingertips. You're not going to need us to tell you where we got it.
Right, exactly. And so it's just like, you think like, oh, we're making this up or whatever, whether or not you think that, it's just so obviously set up. And it's so obviously setting up Black and brown people for failure on purpose.
So that we can get out of giving them equality, because white people never benefited from that equality in the first place. And that's what people are saying when they say that we're still dealing with slavery. We're still dealing with it. We definitely are still dealing with the wavelengths of that, because we've never actually eradicated that system in our country. It has just changed names, and the current name is the war on drugs. Yep. So getting to President Ronald Reagan, dear God, pray for us. In his Anti-Drug Act of 1968, he spent millions and millions of taxpayer dollars on the incarceration of drug abusers. But he cut millions of dollars on education and rehabilitation of those drugs. So it's literally like handing candy to a baby and then sending the baby to prison because they had the candy that you handed them. He had no interest whatsoever in actually eradicating the drugs. He had every bit of interest in making sure that the people with the drugs went to prison, because the people with the drugs were the ones who were Black, brown, and anti-war protesters, the people that Reagan did not like. If you have not seen CNN's The 80s, they do a really nice job, and I think it is on Netflix.
Yeah, it is.
As well. They do a really nice job of mapping out the Reagan years and the tough number that he really did, not only with the war on drugs, but deregulating the media and a lot of other things that I could go on and on about, which I will not, because they are not on topic to this podcast. But check it out if you are interested. So because Reagan, and he did it very quietly, so he made this big deal about, I'm going to put all these drug abusers away, and he showed all those statistics, and he put it in his address to the nation multiple times, but he never talked about, and no one ever, we didn't have Twitter back then, God loved Twitter for everything it is and that it isn't. People do a really nice job of fact checking on Twitter most of the time. We didn't have that back then for people to be like, oh wait, but he cut from education and rehabilitation. So no one was paying attention. No one was watching in the 80s. Everybody assumed that their kid wasn't the one doing it because the person who was doing it is behind bars. Thank God. Thank you, Reagan. Rather than misunderstanding that the lack of education and rehabilitation of communities and of the drugs and the drug abusers made it so that
Yeah.
more people were using drugs than ever before. The 1980s were you saw a huge spike in drug abuse.
Right. And it was so funny too. Megan and I are always just like looking at stuff, and I was like, when did like that Just Say No campaign come out?
Oh,
And we
come
were
on,
trying
90s
to
babies.
remember. And it was just like, come on, Nancy. She just is like, everybody remembers Just Say No
The DARE
to drugs.
program.
And that it's you. It's the individual's fault for accessing or using drugs. It's not the system that's set up the way it is. It's not any kind of mental health support, education. It didn't matter what your situation is. It's your fault if you take the drugs and you get caught with them.
Period. All by yourself. And I think, here I want to stop just for a second, because I know a lot of people who has said to me and will say, nobody made you, like, nobody held you down and made you take drugs and all of that. And for that, I would really encourage everyone to listen to our War on Poverty, The Cycle of Poverty. Because when you're in a cycle of something, and a community is in a cycle of something, and I think with the opioid crisis, that has really opened up the eyes of white people, because it's happening to white people, which we'll get to the opioid crisis probably in part 2.
Yeah.
But when you're in a cycle of something, and also when something is chemically addictive to you, or you have that chemical addiction, or you have the mental health or whatever it is, it's a lot harder than what you might think to say no to those things, or to not start. And once you start, it's a lot harder to stop. And it certainly is hard to stop by yourself. And I really reject this idea in general. The United States is very much about, our culture is very much about individualism, and we made it as self-made. I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe that anyone is self-made. I don't believe that anyone did anything by themselves. Even the most wonderful and hardworking of individuals definitely had help somewhere, and that's beautiful. We are a community, and that's why I believe in taxes. Other. Yes, that's why I believe in community programs. That's why I believe in the government. At its core, we should help each other. So it doesn't help you. I mean, I live in Montgomery County, one of the largest opioid counties in America. Yeah, it doesn't help me that people are dying of drug overdose literally down the street from me, because they literally are. That doesn't help me. That doesn't help my kids. It doesn't make me feel safe. It doesn't make my economy good. It doesn't help my property tax. It doesn't help my kids' schools. It doesn't do any of that. So it really, truly is in our best interest to get rid of these stigmas.
It's exactly what they want. And by they being this larger power of control. And typically that's a white man's culture. That's the white idea of what your life should be. You shouldn't be doing those things, and it's your fault if there are negative consequences.
Absolutely.
And I just want to be like, I don't know how many people have honestly never in their life not taken a single drug. And then with the opioid crisis, with some of those being prescription drugs provided to you by your medical provider,
which is a whole other can of worms.
Your fault. Like, throwing this idea that it's an individual's fault for these issues.
And an individual's responsibility.
Right. And that's not the case. Yes, of course, your decisions affect your life no matter what they are. But it doesn't have to be that it's your fault because you took that drug one time and you got caught and you got sentenced to prison for something so minimal. And then we have rapists, murderers, women, like women being attacked regularly and men not having to face the consequences. I don't know, what is a couple months in prison for raping somebody?
Or what is a couple months in prison for, I don't know, lying to the U.S. government? So I definitely think no matter what your opinion is of the system, you can definitely agree that it is jacked the way that the sentences are being handed out. So thanks to Nancy and her Just Say No, all 90s kids can thank Mr. Bush, the first Bush, H.W. In 1990, he made a huge priority of the war on drugs, possibly because, not a whole lot was going on for him at that time. He created the DARE program with his wife, and all good 90s kids went through the DARE program. And it had a 90% failure rate. And schools are still doing this program. It is not federally required anymore, nor is it federally funded anymore. But it is. I just saw it on somebody's Facebook recently that their kid like graduated from the DARE program. 90% failure rate. 90% of the students in the DARE program later said that they tried drugs or alcohol. And this is because kids are missing what we call the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex of your brain gives you consequences. So when you hold up a poster to kids and you say, oh my gosh, here's the boogeyman, don't do what the boogeyman tells you to do, whether it's sex, drugs, or alcohol, lies, whatever you're telling kids not to do, they are literally going to turn around and do it because you've paid attention to it. And any attention, even negative attention, is infamy. And so kids can't understand developmentally that that's a bad idea because they're missing the frontal cortex of their brain, which does not come through until you are 25 years old. So the DARE program did not have any actual traction whatsoever. But everybody clapped for Bush because nobody was looking into what was developmentally appropriate for the kids in the 90s. Our education system kind of just threw us around for a while. And he also told that he had that huge lie in 1980. Was it? Yep, 1989. Do you remember this, Katie?
Yeah.
He lied. He basically got on television in 1989 and he said, this is, and I can't remember what the drug was. This is a bag of, it was probably crack because that makes sense. This is a bag of crack that was, this person was arrested and I took the drug from the feds so I could show all of you that this happened in front of the White House, la da da da. Turns out, Bush and the feds paid that drug dealer to be in front of the White House and arrested him because they knew he was going to be there because they paid him to be there so that he could have this big success with the war on drugs. I think his ratings might have been down. I'm not sure why. What'd you say?
He wasn't very super interesting.
No, Bush. No. I think he needed to be interesting. So in a great Hollywood fashion, he literally falsified this situation. And people found out I think the Washington Post had posted it by the end of the year that they looked into it and realized that it was a lie. So that was kind of a black spot in his presidency. However, we've been ragging on the Republicans. We now reach ourselves.
Come on in, Clinton.
Let's go, Clinton. Let's go. Another one of my faves. You would like to think that as a Democrat, President Clinton did all of these great things regarding the war on drugs, right, Katie?
It's looking back, you're like, oh, we had that one bright spot of a Democrat. So of course all of the policies were great. Of course there was all this support. Of course there was all of these, wonderful things that were happening. And that's not necessarily the truth.
It's definitely not the truth.
So I think we're going to take a break now. And we'll come back to really go after
poor Bill Clinton.
Mr. Bill Clinton.
Mr. Bill Clinton. Hey, it's Megan and Katie from Two White Girls Show. Thanks so much for listening. We are at a break right now, and we'd love to share with you some of the people that we're following on Twitter. They give us a lot of great factual information, give us a lot of ideas, and a lot of personal experience that we've learned from.
Definitely. So one of our favorite Twitter suggestions is Races, RAISES, which does a lot of family reunification and legal support at the border or for asylees and those in detention. And so there's a lot of really great resources that they post that actually gives you a real on-the-ground feel of what's going on at the border.
Another person that we really like to follow is the Crooked Media. Crooked Media and Pod Save the People, Pod Save the World was created by Obama administration workers, including the Wilderness, Jon Favreau, who I continually talk about. He was a writer for President Obama. And they came together after Donald Trump won the election, and they said, what are we going to do? So they created Pod Save the People, then it became Pod Save the World, and the whole Crooked Media staff. So following all of them individually, but just starting with following Crooked Media, is a really great way to stay up on, especially the 2020 candidates, and other kind of like breaking news things that are happening. They do have a lot of it of a liberal slant, but it is nice. It's a nice community to be a part of.
Definitely. Another one to follow is the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. It's really important to see what they're doing so you can stay abreast of different criminal or civil cases that they are fighting. Not criminal. And they're doing a lot of pushback, especially for certain policies or procedures that the administration think that they can do. And it's really great to just also get more, to stay in touch with what they're working on, what's going on, what are they up against. So definitely give them a follow. There's different locations. You can follow just the ACLU, or there may be specific locations near you.
Another one that we really like to follow is Black Lives Matter. They do have a national Twitter as well as local Twitters. So I know like Black Lives Matter Cincinnati, Black Lives Matter Baltimore. So whichever one you'd like to follow, they do a really nice job of giving real updates as well as just getting connected, especially if you're not connected with the Black Lives Matter movement or you're not familiar. That's a great way to start getting connected and getting to understand what it is that Black Lives Matter is working for.
Right. And someone else along those lines is Shaun King. There's a variety of different things that he pushes, but he is actively working to change the way certain prosecutors in a variety of areas are being elected, because we've touched on this a little bit previously, that prosecutors are often elected and they often have a lot of power over who ends up being tried to go to prison or jail. And so he does a lot in terms of pushing those particular campaigns, feeding out that information. So in terms of understanding what's going on in our justice world with prosecutors and judges, he has some really great stuff that he tweets out.
So that is it for now. We will have other breaks that talk about other people we like to follow on Twitter, but that was just a few. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter as well. We do a lot of retweeting of these people, some tweeting of our own, and some commenting. So thanks for listening, and I hope you're enjoying our podcast.
Thanks, guys.
And we are back. Thanks for taking the quick break with us. We are ready to jump on top of Bill Clinton, for lack of a better phrase there. And really get, all these metaphors are now sounding terrible. So I'm going to stop using them. So I think the important thing to note with the Clinton presidency, and I think I've talked about this podcast a couple times. I think I have a couple of things about it in the break, is The Wilderness by Jon Favreau, which talks about a lot of different things, but there is an entire episode on the Clinton administration. Or possibly 2 episodes. And in it, I really learned, because I was a small child, and besides hearing at school that Bill Clinton was a baby killer, my parents kind of kept me pretty sheltered, as I said in our very first intro podcast. So I didn't know a lot, but it was very eye-opening for me to learn. So I've only learned this very recently. The important thing to understand about Bill Clinton is that he talked a really big game in his first his run up
to be elected.
Yes, to the first time that he was elected. He talked a huge equality game. He got the black vote by a long shot. He got the woman vote by a long shot. And he really won by what is considered a landslide in modern American history. Because he was a populist. People were very excited about what he was saying.
And people were bored with, the
same old Reagan,
our
Bush.
Boring first Bush.
Yeah. So they were ready for something a little new. He was very, people loved Hillary at the time. I know they obviously don't now. We know the end of that story. But they did at the time. So the people loved the Clintons. And he talked a really big game, even about this war on drugs and this idea of mass incarceration and idea inequality. And it was part of what got him elected. But then Clinton spent the better part of his first 4 years as president trying to push through universal health care, which had been a Democrat dream since the Kennedys.
Mm-hmm.
And because it didn't happen, because the Republicans took the House and the Senate, and there are a lot of political reasons as to why it didn't happen. But it didn't happen, and he had spent all of his political capital at the very end of his first term and really needed to be reelected on a second term. So he
pandered to be elected.
Yeah, he pandered.
He sold America to be elected.
Yes. So the second term, he did not sell such a high equality rate, and people voted for him still, and he still won pretty big. While he still condemned mass incarceration, he did not touch it.
It did not stop.
It did not stop. He did not make any headway with policies. He did not discuss it in any of his addresses to the nation. He was very vague when people would ask him questions about it, in order to continue pandering to Black and brown voters, but also to continue pandering to white voters. So he was kind of our first big sit-on-a-fence Democratic president.
It's that middle ground, moderate...
I don't like it, but this is the way things are, and you shouldn't do drugs.
It's fine. Like, it doesn't affect everyone.
And it doesn't, it's not really
It doesn't affect white people.
Yes. And so, I can see, we don't want people to do drugs. So really, by the end of his presidency, he was just about as hard on crime as President Reagan or the first Bush was.
Right. And also, when we say war on drugs, we include crime in that.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was a very... well-executed propaganda against that the word crime or anything to do with crime equaled a Black or brown person.
Yep.
When you hear the word criminal, I'm assuming most of the time you don't think of a white man in a business suit, Wall Street, or,
these days. You didn't in the 90s at least.
No, definitely not in the 90s. And he just continued everything. There was no stopping, pushing, pausing. It was, all of this is fine. Just keep it going, because it also lined pockets.
Yes.
And so we haven't really touched on this that much in terms of the way lobbying is run in our country. More often than not, any opportunities to stem that cash flow from, say, a pharmaceutical company who wants to continue to make money, so they push funding to politicians who will then push their agenda. So what ends up happening is you have these organizations who are these conglomerates of different corporations who want people in prison. They don't make money if people aren't in these prisons.
So the government owes them a certain amount of people every year to go to prison. They have a contract. Like, this is how many people you will send us. I hope.
And again, that sounds like a conspiracy theory,
but it's not,
and it isn't.
I promise that it's not.
That's insane to me.
The links. We'll get you all the links.
That's insane. That it's like, I will give you a minimum amount of people that will be in prison guaranteed. So then, if you are a politician in a certain state where you have to meet this quota and you're being pushed to do these things, you're going to push for incarceration to increase.
Absolutely. Because
you're going to push for people to be arrested.
Or your taxpayers pay money for nothing. I mean, it's like a hotel banquet. You think 350 people are coming to your wedding, only 200 show up. You're still up for that extra 150 people. It's the exact same way that contract works. And we've fact checked ourselves. We promised to put this out on our blog right after the podcast episode does come out, because I do want you guys to know that that's very real. That's very real. It's not a conspiracy theory.
Right. So I think it's just, I want to touch on it with Clinton, because there are certain organizations and certain legislation that was introduced during his presidency that was very, very focused on lobbying, based off of lobbying techniques. And I mean, there are lobbyists actively pumping money into a variety of things. We all know about, like, big pharma not wanting universal health care, also like grant big access for everyone because they lose money, oil, all of these different things that we all necessarily may know about. But for this purpose, there is legislation that is written by someone who will profit off of it that isn't necessarily the politician. They will receive kickbacks for it, but that those are laws that are being pushed and that are being followed because certain people believe in them. So, Clinton.
So thanks, Clinton. And that didn't necessarily start with Clinton, but it was very big under his time in the House and the Senate. And so we did want to take a pause and make sure that everybody's aware of that.
Right. And we will go into that further in part 2 because we just really want to make sure that we're laying this foundation of the timeline of how where we are today.
And how this has been intentionally set up and passed down from administration to state and local governments.
Right.
So people are sick of a Democrat because it wasn't much different than a Republican. So we now elect George W. Bush, and that's really the first president that I have like actual waking memory of. So I'm showing my young age, I guess. But as we know, as all good 90s babies know, that W had a lot of things going on in his presidency. And I think one of the biggest wake-up calls, it wasn't enough of a wake-up call for our entire country, but one of the biggest wake-up calls for myself and for a lot of other people was watching his handling of Hurricane Katrina. And realizing that there were very intentionally, especially people who do not live in segregated areas, that there are very intentionally segregated areas that are low poverty, high minority, and the mass destruction that happened to their communities in Katrina, and the lack of, and compared now to Trump and Puerto Rico, it's I mean, at least he flew over, I suppose, but
it's eerily similar.
It's eerily similar, and Trump only made it worse. But it was a real start to, oh my gosh, we have these people. They're Americans. They're basically essentially living in this precinct that kind of looks like a third world country, and it's been completely demolished. What little they did have completely demolished, and we're not really doing anything about it. And I did visit the Katrina site later in college. So we were in, what was this probably? The year my grandma died was probably 2010. In 2010, which was years after Katrina, and still it's decimated. And our university is still sending students to that area, which means it is still decimated.
Right.
And so this might not sound like it is directly correlated to the war on drugs, but it is, because it's correlated to this idea that we have incredibly segregated communities that have incredibly separate resources, and it is set up for Black and brown and even low income white communities to not succeed, and drugs are a part of that, poverty is a part of that, crimes a part of that, and lack of FEMA resources is a part of that. And if you didn't notice that then now you're noticing it now.
Yeah. And I think, too, what's important with W is he had a lot going on.
He did.
I mean, he had 9/11, the Iraq War, Afghanistan. There was the housing crisis towards the end of his administration. And there was a lot going on for him. And then on top of that, just being kind of dumb really didn't help him. And I think there was a lot of things with him that was just not well thought out. And at this same time, all of these things are happening. War is an economy stimulator, kind of. But these are, not everyone agrees with these wars in a similar fashion to Vietnam. And then there's no stopping this mass incarceration. There's no push to look at anything else, or have different opportunities that are available, looking at poverty, the root causes, and then you just keep slamming all these different things home. And for what really helped me in preparing for this, and Megan had mentioned the 80s CNN series. They did a 90s and a 2000s, and the 2000s was really interesting. It's 2000 to 2010. So I recommend watching it because it really helps you kind of go back into that mind frame of what it was like post 9/11, and how that nationalism was really intense. So then there was this interesting split between those who were pro quote unquote America and those who were against the Iraq war. And so
I think like I would love to do honestly like a whole podcast on 9/11 because that really that shapes so much of where we are today.
yep.
But I think what we need to only talk about in this podcast and is that Bush, after 9/11, Bush was given the political capital to do anything, and needed to, and politicians needed to seem like they were anti-crime, anti-terrorism, tough on any boogeyman that was going to come into your home and kill your family, because we'd been attacked and people were very afraid. And there is, my mother's religion is Catholicism, my father's religion is Star Wars, and there is nothing worse than fear, and that is what Star Wars has taught me. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate leads to suffering.
And Harry Potter.
Well, Harry Potter was my own. But
yeah, I know, but I'm just saying.
Oh, yes, and yes, I did learn that as well. You're right. But I originally learned it from Star Wars, so thanks, Dad.
Yeah.
There's your shout out. But he complained because I talk about my mom too much. I think because we were so afraid of terrorism, that bled into this war on drugs and this war on crime as well. And if you were any kind of politician talking about how we shouldn't incarcerate people, how people should have lower minimum sentences, all of these things, it felt as if you were basically handing over your job. And so there was no political capital whatsoever for equality at this point, because white people felt attacked. And so we've traction that people had gained, we've demolished. Any kind of forethought, especially when thinking about equality and this mass incarceration and the drug community and the problems of crack and black communities and all of these things, or legalizing weed, whatever, any kind of conversation about that stopped for probably 15 years. Because people were so afraid to sound like you said, anti-American. Nationalism and tough on crime, pro-military all got wrapped into one little package, and you had to buy it or you weren't an American. And that was
I remember, I don't know about you, but in high school I used to get in fights all the time with people. All the time. I was this lonely little liberal in a sea of red, of fighting with people being like, who would just tell me how anti-American I am. And I'm like, I don't care. I think you're dumb. That's not true. Because it's like, that's not the messaging.
No.
But it is.
We're here for
messaging.
Yeah, we're here for a better America. But I think it's important to know at this time, liberals weren't really doing a lot with mass incarceration, or there wasn't a lot going on at all, because no one had the political capital to do it. And that's where we really got this idea of a centrist. And I recently asked a friend if they thought Trump voters or centrists were worse, and they said centrist. So that was an interesting answer.
Interesting.
It was an interesting answer. It made me think. But I definitely think that's when people stopped trusting that we didn't need to just lock up all the bad guys, and that there weren't a million bad guys that we need to lock up, and it was like white America especially, against the rest of the world. And that made it really, really difficult. And that makes those conversations that we're having now about mass incarceration still extremely difficult, because people are still holding on to this boogeyman that was created during 9/11, which again, I'd love to do a podcast on just 9/11 and everything that goes with that.
Something that's important also is that, George W. was given everything. Anything he wanted. All of those 9/11 era policies are still in effect, and they are awful. So many of them, it isn't in the traditional Republican set of less government. All of those policies are more government. more control, more oversight. And it's just super fascinating that people who have this idea of wanting less government welcomed with open arms more government based on fear.
Yeah, and fear really drove the 2000s for a long time. And so it's important to note W ended his presidency with the housing crisis. If you have not seen The Big Short, it is no longer on Netflix, but I'm happy to give you my Prime. Just DM me. But
same.
I definitely think it's an important movie to watch. It is not necessarily a documentary, but I've never understood the housing crisis more. And the only reason I say that the housing crisis, I talk even about the housing crisis in this War on Drugs podcast, is it is a very perfect example of our system choosing not to incarcerate people who very criminally crashed our economy for personal gain in the most blatant and disgusting way. They were bailed out, whether or not you feel those bailouts were good or not. I know that was President Obama. I think people I have very mixed feelings on them. I think, at the end of the day, it's not the big rich people who are getting bailed out who are going to suffer if they don't get bailed out. It's all of the people who are working at the plants and things like that. So that's a whole other thing. But I think it was a very blatant decision not to incarcerate those people as we continue to incarcerate people for nonviolent and violent drug offenses, which I think we can all agree crashing the economy for personal gain is definitely higher on the totem pole.
You'd think you'd be in prison for life. Just saying. You'd think you would, because there was so much going on. And, speaking of Obama, of bailing out the banks, bailing out a lot of the mortgage situations, and allowing this kind of real interesting recession, opportunities of like, what do you do to get out of a recession or to stimulate the economy? You put money into the hands of the people who will spend it.
Whoop, and we're going back to War on Poverty. Go back to our anti-poverty economy stimulators. Yay!
If you give people money for food, they will buy it.
Build it, they will come.
If you give people money for their rent, if you keep the housing costs low, people can put their money into different things.
They can landscape. They can make it look pretty. They can make it nice.
Right. There are ways to do things, to make things look the way you want them to, by putting the money into the hands of the people who can spend it.
And who need to spend it.
And have to. If all of us started hoarding our money,
the economy would tank.
Collapse. Which is another
the Great Depression. That's why we had
and which is why there's so much fear around our generation being so indebted with student loans
and not buying houses and not.
We are unable.
We're not buying the economy
to put the money back, and that's why we also have everyone's freaking out about the, what millennials are destroying, like Applebee's. Oh no, I'm so.
We're not. No one's gonna miss Applebee's.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
Yeah,
but it's one of those things where it's like our spending power is bigger, but yet we have less capital to spend.
Yes.
And that's why policies aimed at helping those in student loan debt will actually support and stimulate our economy more,
because we'll have more money to spend
than by penalizing those with student loan debt.
And again, I think it just goes back to, that word, I'm so glad you used that word, penalizing, because at the end of the day, we are at a crossroads, and, we're going to wrap up part 1 here in a second and go into part 2 with another episode. But I want you to be thinking, we're at a crossroads in America right now. Do we punish people for their actions, or do we help people get out of their actions? Whatever those things may be, whether it's I didn't pay my student loans, or I'm in so much student loan debt I can't pay it back, or I crossed the border because I'm trying to flee for my family's life and safety, but I I don't have money or a house or anything that I need to, and I need help getting set up in the United States.
Yeah.
Or is it that I used drugs once when I was 19 years old, or I was caught with drugs, or I had a violent or non-violent drug offense when I was young and I'm in prison for 25 years? Do you penalize people for that? Or do you help people rehabilitate their situation, whatever it might be? And I think that's a big theme and overarching essential question that Katie and I keep coming back to.
And I think it's part of it too is a little bit with the opioid crisis.
Absolutely.
Everyone keeps saying that they're coming at it in a different way. And it is this idea that what's happening is the jails have become these detox centers.
And it's miserable. And that's what my dad left being a police officer, because it was just a detox center. He hated watching it.
Right. And so it's like, if you think that people would choose to be there of their own free will 1000%, or, you know, that this idea that mental health isn't a problem, or just punish them, lock them up, who cares?
Or that's not people straight or whatever it is. I mean,
it's not actually going to necessarily help anyone or stimulate our economy.
Yeah.
And
at the end of the day,
reduce poverty.
Yeah, we are a community, and when your neighbor is hurting, if you don't have compassion for that, the least you can see is that hurt your property value, because they're not going to mow their lawn. At the end of the day, if that's all you've got, all of this hurts the economy. And so I don't want to lose the compassion piece of this. I think Katie and I both feel that on a very deep and real level every day. And we follow a lot of people on Twitter, and I hope you'll follow us on Twitter and see some of the things that we retweet, because they do come from that compassion place. But also, if you're not able to come from that compassion place, if that's not your forte, if that's uncomfortable for you to wrap your mind around at first, it hurts the economy. The war on drugs has tanked the economy. Scaling back of benefits programs has tanked the economy. All of these things are hurting our economy and keeping everyone from evening out their grounds. Whether you're black or brown or white or whatever, everyone's hurting from this, unless you are a 1%. I hope that you can see the compassion piece, because to me that's our humanity, but I can't make anybody have that. So at least in the economy piece. With that, we are going to end our part 1 on the war on drugs. I hope that it was enlightening for you. Please, if you haven't, go watch The 13th, The Big Short, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s on Netflix. Again, DM us if you need help getting access to those things.
We will give you access.
Make sure that if you're interested in the facts, as I always am, that you're following our blog on WordPress. Katie, that's, what is it?
2whitegirlshow.wordpress.com.
We will be putting out all the links and just more information, factual information that you can read into, helping you with that Google search, and just also some books that have really helped Katie and I understand these issues. Follow us on Twitter. It's 2whitegirlshow1. That's our handle, 2whitegirlshow1. And let us know if you're interested in being a guest. And part 2 for War on Drugs is up and coming. And then we'll continue on from there. So thanks so much for listening, guys.
Thanks, guys.